The U.S. women's national team is back from their extended summer break, and we have a roster to discuss. Going to be talking about Emma Hayes' internal logic as she discussed it with the media this morning. Oh, I should probably say what we're doing here. I'm Claire Watkins. This is this week's edition of The Late Sub. It is Wednesday, October 15th. I'm too excited about the U.S. women's national team roster. Got a lot to jump in here. We're going to be talking about each individual line, players that are in, players that are out, what Hayes is doing, and the vision for the future, and why there's a lot to be excited about as we go into this 3-game international window at the end of October. Let's jump in. So after a bit of a break, the U.S. women's national team is back with a 26-player roster for their upcoming October friendlies. The first two will be against Portugal, and there will be a third against New Zealand in Kansas City. This group that we saw announced today is that promised sort of marriage between European-based players and the NWSL players that, we saw players in Europe get some time off over the summer, well-earned, players like Lindsay Hughes, Katarina Macario, Lily Johannes, etc. Hayes wanted to give these players some time off during that short break in the European calendar, fully deserved. But now things are getting serious. Naomi Girma is still out. She will be the one player missing from that group, still dealing with that calf injury that has delayed her Chelsea debut for this season. Hopefully, Hayes said in her availability today that hopefully Girma is in that return to play protocol. They are expecting her back maybe next week, something like that. But obviously you never want to throw someone into an international camp without having gotten to play themselves in a little bit. So hopefully we'll be seeing a steady return for Girma. She'll be able to make the last friendlies of the year, but not this month. But my first impression of this, and Hayes underlined this, we're going to be going back to what Hayes talked about today when she spoke to media a lot. She spoke for over 40 minutes. She had a lot to say. It's been a minute since she'd had a chance to speak publicly. But this is the beginning of the group that we are going to see feature for the team in World Cup qualifiers next year. Now, this is something that's maybe flying under the radar, but World Cup qualifiers next year are in the late fall. They are not in the summer like we are used to seeing them. They're going to be in the late fall. So we are nearing that 1 year point for World Cup qualifiers. And Hayes has now moved out of this player pool experimentation era of the cycle into how do we hone this into a group that we believe can not only win World Cup qualifiers, but in the year after that, maybe possibly compete to win a World Cup. And so my first impression of that, this beginning of the beginning of getting serious here, is that this roster, which we will go through player by player, but it's still pretty young. I don't know what exactly I expected. Maybe this is just sort of trained from years of covering this team, but when you think about the European-based players or the fact that you had some older players coming, working through injuries, stuff like that, you maybe always expect like the cavalry to come in with the U.S. women's national team. Maybe again, it's like thinking about that 2019 team, that 2021 Tokyo team, that 2023 World Cup team, where you're like, oh, of course, there's going to be some veteran that comes in, even if they're not 100%. We're going to have some of those personality locker room call-ups. This did not really do that, though. Hayes, I think, feels very confident in the work she's been doing over the last 18 months to not feel like you necessarily just need those personality call-ups, and she talks about this for one particular player, which again, we'll get into a little bit later. If she is going to have that leadership note, that player coming in because of what they bring to the locker room, they still really have to be playing for their club teams, and they have to have an on-field argument for being on the roster. The average age of this team going into these October friendlies is under 25 years old. There's only 3 players over the age of 30 in Heaps, Emily Sonnet, and Rose Lavelle. Hayes really did underline that this was the first sort of like kill your darlings roster after that year of experimentation, a pivot shift into building that chemistry. Hayes is still very committed to the ongoing development of the program. There will be another U23 camp concurrent to this one in their first stop in Philly next week. She's not giving up on that process. And she has said that even those players that maybe are on the senior team this month might be on that U23 team next month. There's still going to be some flip-flopping with that eye for 2 years from now for 2027. But things are getting serious, but the training wheels are still off here. And I think this is the first moment where we go, yeah, We've gone through this experiment of change and growth, and this is a brand new U.S. Women's National Team. This is not the U.S. Women's National Team from the Paris Olympics, certainly not the U.S. Women's National Team from the 2023 World Cup. And even when you're looking at these different position lines, you go like, where's the adult in the room? Who's the player that's going to be that overall veteran presence? But I think because of the generational shift that we've seen, that doesn't exist. And I think that's going to be fine, which is also really exciting and a testament to the work that Hayes has done. There are still some returns to come, as we know. I think, again, everyone's waiting for more triple espresso to make their way back after Sophia Wilson. She had her baby, I think, about a month ago now. I think that, we'll be seeing Mallory Swanson in 2026 as well. But I don't know. This is getting closer and closer. And I like that Hayes is betting on the work that's been done and the potential for the future, as opposed to feeling like she needs to be working players in because she doesn't trust the youngsters that she herself has developed. So let's get granular. We're going to start with the front line. We're going to work our way back. We're going to do forwards, midfielders, defenders, and then goalkeepers, and just talk about some of the players who are in, some of the players who are out, some of the things Hayes said about those decisions, and what combinations we'd like to see. So starting with the forwards, we have Michelle Cooper, Katarina Macario, Trinity Rodman, Yasmin Ryan, Emma Sears, Ali Sentner, and Alyssa Thompson. Not a ton of surprises here. Again, like I said, no huge cavalry call in for a veteran or anything like that. But these are the players that I think have both been competing well for club and for country. I'm very impressed by Cooper, Sears, and Sentner's abilities to make themselves undroppable. I think maybe when you look at the possibilities of these different combinations and you think, okay, what does Sears bring? What does Sentner bring? What does Cooper bring? I think they show up to camp every single month and they're ready to work their butts off and they're competing well and they're performing well in games. They're making themselves very, very difficult to drop. Hayes also very clearly sees the value of speedy wingers like Sears or the connectivity of Ryan and Sentner and Michelle Cooper kind of being that two-way player who her defensive work rate is very, very good and her collaborative work rate is very, very good. I think, for example, everyone was talking about the return of Trinity Rodman today, which almost feels like, something that you would take for granted, or you would think, obviously, she's been playing at a best 11 level for the last, 4 or 5 weeks. But it's sort of an incredible comeback for her from that lingering back injury that held her out for parts of the year. I think she's going to be making a late run to a possible best 11 for the NWSL for this year after coming back and looking better than ever. Getting her back injury right, Hayes very much credited that collaboration between the Washington Spirit and the U.S. Women's National Team where Robin removed herself from the team environment for a little bit this summer to really get that back right. That's a huge success story for the trainers in both club and country, and the ability for them to work together to get Rodman where she needs to be. Hayes says that she likes Cooper and Rodman kind of competing in camp for time on that right wing. I think that also is really interesting. It's good because it doesn't place too much pressure on Rodman to spend too much time out there if that doesn't make sense for her in terms of workload. The Spirit have been very busy between league play and CONCACAF Champions Cup play going right into U.S. Women's National Team play. I think I'm sure they're going to be very mindful not to overwork Rodman. Cooper's a great option to have. I think those two are actually very similar in many ways, where Rodman has that additional level of the finishing at the international level and the confidence and the experience. But in terms of what they do kind of box to box as this two-way defensive and attacking player that's really good at collaborating with the midfield, I like those as the two like for likes on the right wing. And kind of to that point, talking about the attack as a whole, I really like how clearly defined the roles are in this group. And I think that's probably part of the reason why Hayes put this particular group of players together, right? You've got Macario and Sentner in the center. Macario, very good back to goal. She's very good as a connecting false nine. Sentner increasingly doing that more and more. I really like those Kansas City formations where they've got her sitting beneath Chawinga, but also, as we know, Sentner can run at a back line. She's more of a hybrid player in that way. I really like those two in the center attack. Got Sears and Thompson maybe on the left side, Robin and Cooper on the right side. Ryan has a ton of flexibility. She's almost like a super sub out there. When she starts, she's very good at collaborating in the midfield, a very creative player, just a smart player. And that's the kind of perfect player for international duty where you know that no matter what instructions you give her, she's going to be able to execute those. And I think it fixes that sort of imbalance that's maybe existed for the U.S. in recent years where they overload the wing talent. Everyone goes, okay, so should this player play outside? Should this player play inside? How do you best get the best three players on the pitch? And they didn't overly consider the center forward role. As we know, they struggled to replace Alex Morgan over time. Or you had Sophia Wilson come in and do incredibly in that role, but then she was out for a year. So I just really like that for this particular camp. And like I said, Wilson will be back, but for this particular camp, These roles are very clearly defined, which sets players up to succeed, and I think will pay off in some pretty cool stuff in these games. Jaden Shaw, who we'll talk about in a second, I think could also see time in this front line, but hopefully not out in a wide role. I think the winger depth kind of speaks for itself. But let's talk about that. Let's move on to the midfielders. 8 midfielders, which are going to be Sam Coffey, Lindsay Heaps, Claire Hutton, Rose Lavelle, Sam Meza, Olivia Moultrie, Jaden Shaw, and Lily Johannes. As mentioned, Jaden Shaw's return is probably the big headline here. Hayes spoke today about how happy she was about Shaw's ambitious ability to get that trade to Gotham from North Carolina when things were not working, with the courage to set her personal goals back on track. I think that amount of ambition from a player, the proactive nature of what Shaw did, and obviously the immediate success that she's seeing as part of the Gotham lineup is a huge part of this. Hayes specifically called this call up an opportunity to see how Shaw has grown from the last time she was called into senior camp. This is, though, where we talk about Hayes, when I mentioned at the top, her longer development plan. She says that these younger players might continue to flip-flop between the senior team and the U23s. I think that, so for a player like Shaw, I think actually in a nice way, when she says something like that, it's trying to take some of the pressure off of a player like Shaw. Perhaps, a player like Moultrie, who is still trying to convert that club form into international form. Just again, taking some of the pressure off of these younger players who might overthink an opportunity like this, or a player like Shaw, who I think we've seen her confidence levels shift at times, where she'll sometimes go into the U.S. Women's National Team environment and just crush it and look like, the next best thing for maybe at the number 10, or we talk about sort of that false 9 role for her. But we've also seen her come into an international camp and kind of disappear. And so I like that Hayes is saying, we saw her compete with the U23s in the last camp. She did really, really well. We're going to see her in the senior team because of what she's doing for her club. If that doesn't go the way we necessarily want it to go, we're going to take her back to the U23s. Like, this is a long-term play for a player like Shaw, and I really, really like that. I find the addition of San Meza interesting. She's been excellent for the Seattle Reign this season. My only question mark with Meza, and I just need to see more time for her with the U.S., which is I don't know if what Seattle does every week, which is that high possession football, very methodical, kind of not an overwhelming amount of scoring chances, but you try to make those incredibly high quality chances. I don't know if that's always replicable in an international setting, where you kind of have to attune things to your opponent a little bit more and you get less time with your teammates, and you do need all of those scoring opportunities to count. But this group that we see here with like Coffey, Hutton, Johannes is a high possession midfield. So Meza does fit that bill. I think in terms of her player profile, I completely understand why she was included into this group. But again, that leap from what seems like a very heavily drilled week in, week out system with Seattle, putting that into an international environment where for all your best laid plans, you do a little bit just kind of have to like show up and go. I'm curious to see how that, switch flips for her. I also think it's interesting, if you were listening to the podcast next week, I do think it's interesting that Corbin Schrader, who has been starting for Lyon, is not on this team. I talked last week about even just sort of the minutes that she's getting for Lyon versus Lily Johannes versus a Lindsay Heaps, kind of how that's managed at the club level, I think is going to be a little bit of the canary in the coal mine for what we've seen with the U.S. Women's National Team. I find it very interesting that she is still on the outside looking in for the senior team. I have talked about why I think that might not be the worst move, especially with some of the other form that we've seen from some of these other young players. But it just kind of contradicts maybe where Hayes says that she's been at with a player like Schrader. She wants those minutes for club. She wants players to be ambitious. I think Schrader did a very similar thing to Shaw, making that leap to Lyon. She started in that Champions League game last week against Arsenal. I'm like contradicting myself maybe, because I don't think I'm actually making an argument for Schrader to get back into the senior team over any of these other players on this line. But I am always curious about Hayes' internal logic and where that leads her. And so I think that's something to watch as well. Like I said, Moultrie, for example, playing incredibly well for Portland. She's one of the best midfielders, I think, in the entire league this year, but we still just haven't seen that level of form for country in a long time. And then, kind of jumping off of the evaluation, which again, we're moving away from a little bit more. What are the combinations we're going to see? You guys know me. I love the Coffey, Hutton, Johannes midfield. I'm very interested to see how Shaw can connect. I think Shaw, my hope is that a player like Shaw with a player like Johannes, who is that true connecting number 8 who can support on the defensive end, can hold possession, doesn't lose the ball, can make those passes, can open a player like Shaw up a lot, can open a player like Rose Lavelle up. I think, again, the cultivation of what that number 8 role is going to impact Coffey at the number 6 and any of these other myriad of attacking midfielders. I think Moultrie could learn a lot from a player like Johannes. I think they're two different kind of player profiles, but I'm sure that Hayes would love to see a little bit more of that calm in the midfield rub off on a player like Moultrie. Just a lot of opportunities for growth. And I think that all of these players are very technically gifted. I'm fascinated to see if we see a more attacking style midfield or if we see a more conservative midfield where we see him with Heaps as the point of the attack, which has not even necessarily been bad because that provides support for Coffey, which we know sometimes needs that for lack of pace. Like, I love this midfield because I think there are a variety of different small things you could do, whether you're trying to dictate pace, whether you're trying to dictate possession, whether you're trying to make sure that you're defensively sound in front of your center back duo, which will be without Naomi Girma. There's just a lot to dig into here. And I think that Hayes has given herself a really nice group to be able to do some nuanced stuff depending on the opposition, which I think they're going to see very different midfields between Portugal and New Zealand. So just want to see those young combos, want to continue to see the development, want to see the development of the number 8 as support for both the number 10 and the number 6. I think Hayes here is trying to put a system together as opposed to being hyper reliant on certain players to be available, which I fully support. I think it's going to be the lifeblood of the program as they continue to become a more technical footballing side. And this is the group to do it. So I love this midfield. Just, again, very fascinated to see what they end up doing in terms of these different combinations. It's not an overly physical midfield is maybe the one thing. But I think that's what Hayes is going for. I saw someone on social media, and I think this is fair, talking about like moving away from a player like Taylor Flint, not moving towards even a player like Jalen Howell's been playing very well for Gotham. Some of those more like physical players imposing on set pieces, more of these defensive bruisers that make it very difficult to break the US's defensive line in transition. This just isn't where I think Hayes sees the talent identification right now. And I also think it's philosophical. I think that Hayes came in with a very clear plan of wanting to change the way the U.S. Women's National Team plays football in the midfield. And is the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction? It's kind of hard to say, but I think that this is a group that is worth spending some time on and time with. Moving to defenders. There are a couple notes on the defenders. Again, I think Girma's absence looms very large. That's going to be the defenders. 8 defenders are Jordan Bugg, Emily Fox, Lily Reel, Tara Mickione, Avery Patterson, Emily Sams, Emily Sonnet, and Kennedy Wesley in her first U.S. Women's National Team senior team call-up. Some of the notes from Hayes on this when speaking to media. Hayes is pretty high on Jordan Bugg, which I find very interesting. She was hedging a little bit more Bugg's potential, I think, in previous camps. I think she just loves the way that she plays for Seattle. This was the first time I think Hayes was like, yeah, a player like Jordan Bugg is in the running for 2027. Maybe not necessarily going to make that World Cup qualifying roster, but anything can happen in 2 years. I like that. I like that kind of when she's watching a player like that for club, she's growing in her confidence of even speaking about that player. I think we're going to see very interesting center back combinations. I'm expecting Emily Sonnet to play a lot to keep the back line calm. Emily Fox, I think, similarly, is going to get a pretty significant run out. They are going to have veteran leadership. I think it's great, actually, that Fox at this point is that player for them. Not a newbie. She's been there. She's done it. She's showcased a lot of leadership qualities from that outside back position. And I think that it's going to be really nice to have her back in there. I do think the other outside back, whether it's backing a player like Fox up or playing on the left, is still wide open. I still think there's a lot of opportunity for a player like Patterson, player like Reel. And Hayes did know this is one that is worthwhile to talk about when talking about sort of veteran leadership versus playing time. Crystal Dunn is still not with the U.S. Women's National Team simply because, and Hayes put this very clearly, she's not getting minutes with PSG right now. It's killing Hayes. I think Hayes would love for Dunn to be in this camp or to be in the mix a little bit more as a leader and as someone who has something to give to this team. She even said today that she does not think that Dunn does not have a future with the U.S., but she's not playing for PSG. Hayes put it pretty bluntly. She's played about 300 minutes since the 2024 Olympics. She's available for selection. She's not getting on the field. And Hayes is not willing to bring a player in if that is the case for them at the club level. So poor Dunn is kind of getting singled out here because that was the question asked today, but a good look inside Hayes' philosophy of you need to be getting minutes, but once you are, you're going to be jumping right back in because she loves the qualities that Dunn brings. Hayes also mentioned Kayla Sharples of the Kansas City Current as a player who just missed the cut. Might be an age thing. Sharples is older, obviously, than a player like Bug or a player like Wesley, but she spoke very highly of just in general what the Kansas City Current are doing with that back line, said it was a difficult decision on where she wanted to go in that direction. I think in that context, it's interesting that Sams is back in. Sams has been having a less good year than her, career high of last year. I'm curious to see if we're going to see more of Tara McKeown, who seems to be getting more minutes when Gurma is not available. So just, really fascinating here with the back line. It's a little bit less, flashy, shiny than some of the other combinations that we might be seeing up top. But there's a lot to dig into here when it comes to who's going to be playing left back, who's going to be looking for those backup center back roles, which again, I think Sonnet is going to be really setting the tone, seeing Fox's leadership from the right side. And just how players do. I think that Portugal is going to be a really good team to test some of the fortitude, especially when I'm not entirely sure how much possession the U.S. is going to hold in a game like that. They might be more willing to hit on the counter. And then going to goalkeepers, 3 goalkeepers, ones we know well, ones that have been pretty consistent over 2025, Claudia Dickey, Mandy McGlynn, Fallon, Tullis, Joyce. Hayes today tipped PTJ as the front runner in terms of experience. She's very, very happy with what she's been doing as the starter for Manchester United, both at the league level and now newly at the Champions League level. I think also interesting in the context of this 3 is that Mandy McGlynn has been benched for Utah at times this season. So we are actually, I guess, seeing the goalkeeper unit prioritizing consistency, perhaps over like extensive playing time. That does make sense in some ways. I mean, with the 3 goalkeeper system, you want 3 keepers who work well together. It's kind of the unit working together to create that final product of a player who isn't going to necessarily be rotating enough when we get into the nitty gritty of qualifying or a major tournament. Hayes did say that she expects 2 goalkeepers to get time during this window, but I think we're going to see Tullis Joyce get 2 and maybe Dickey get 1. And I'm very curious to see if McGlynn gets on the pitch based on, again, what she's been seeing for her club team this year and what Hayes kind of envisions for that, the sum of the parts that become that number 1 starting goalkeeper. And then the final thing I just wanted to shout out, this is a lot getting into the roster. I can't wait to see these games. I talked a little about combos. I want to see obviously stuff like that. But I want to close with just a note on the window at large and how it's another good example of a thing that I like that started a little bit before the Hayes administration, but is continuing now. And I think that the U.S. has hit a really lovely tone with it, which is the recognizing of veterans who have retired after they have retired. There are 2 games in this 3-game window where one is going to be recognizing U.S. Women's National Team goalkeeper Alyssa Nair, and one will be recognizing U.S. Women's National Team forward Alex Morgan. I love this new format of giving those players their flowers, getting them in to talk with the team, keeping that through line going, getting these younger players who got less time with them, these legends of the game, these titans of the U.S. Women's National Team program, but without it dominating the game itself. It serves 2 purposes, which is that you're keeping that legacy, that leadership through line very, very clear. You're keeping the standard high. You're reminding these young players what they can themselves achieve and whose footsteps they're following in, but you're also not letting it dominate the game where you're having a player play in that game, which as we know can sometimes lead to like real duds in terms of tactics and lineups and rotations. So I love the way that the U.S. has been doing that. And I, have to mention, obviously, this morning, U.S. Women's National Team forward Kristen Press announced her retirement from professional football at the end of this season. Just another example of the importance of this stuff. I would like to think, she and Tobin Heath have talked about on their podcast some of the conflicting feelings they feel about possibly accepting something like this, where you're getting your flowers after, when the 2 of them had hoped for a long time that they might actually still be in the U.S. Women's National Team conversation in the later years of their careers. I think there are a lot of conflicting feelings, as there always are with retirement. I mean, Press talked about this, about how you don't, you wait for yourself to want to stop playing and it never happens. And so you have to make that call before the fire has died. And that's, it's all very, very conflicting and bittersweet. But I like how the U.S. has been doing this. I would hope that there is a future where a player like Heath or a player like Press feels like they would like to do something like this to impart some of that wisdom onto the next generation, because a career like hers deserves it. And just another good example of why I think Hayes leaning into the youth movement is the right thing to do. We are seeing a changing of the guard, but the exciting thing is it seems like they're ready. And I cannot wait to see how they do this fall. The Late Sub is part of the Just Women's Sports Network. This show is written by Claire Watkins and produced and edited by Parker Fenton. To get more of your favorite women's sports content, subscribe to the Just Women's Sports newsletter and follow Just Women's Sports across all your favorite channels.